Unlock the door.
We're closed, officer. The sign is right there.
I said unlock the door. Open it up. Let's lock here for now. Step outside. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Wait, what for? I told you, this is my store. The license is right there. Failure to comply. Turn around, now.
I'm complying, but this isn't right.
Have a seat over here.
The body camera is already recording when the metal shutter starts coming down. The store lights dim in stages, aisle by aisle, as the last register receipt prints and the front door locks from the inside. According to the footage, it is closing time. The business is no longer open to the public, and the man moving calmly behind the counter is not a customer. He is the owner. Outside, a patrol car rolls to a stop. The officer who steps out is new enough that his uniform still looks uncreased on camera. His voice, captured cleanly by the mic, carries the tone of someone following procedure without fully understanding where its limits are. He approaches the door, pulls on the handle, and finds it locked. The owner looks up, gestures toward the posted hours, and continues closing. At that moment, the legal positions of both men are already fixed, even if neither acknowledges it. The owner is inside a private business after hours, performing ordinary end-of-day tasks. The officer has no visible report of a crime in progress, no indication of forced entry, no call for service tied to the location that has been publicly disclosed in official records. What the officer does next turns a routine end-of-shift scene into a case that will later be decided by a jury. He orders the owner to unlock the door. The owner refuses, calmly, pointing again to the sign. According to the footage, there is no raised voice, no aggressive movement. The officer responds by opening the side entrance, stepping inside, and instructing the owner to place his hands behind his back. Within seconds, handcuffs are applied. This is not a misunderstanding frozen in time. It is an action with legal weight. The moment the cuffs close, the encounter is no longer a conversation. It is a detention that now requires justification under the Fourth Amendment. That justification will be examined frame by frame months later. The officer does not know that yet. What he also does not know is who he has just restrained. Court records later show that the man in handcuffs had spent years operating the store under valid licenses, passing inspections, and complying with local regulations. More importantly, he had previously interacted with city enforcement without incident, including instances where officers had deferred to his authority as the lawful proprietor during after-hours checks. None of that history appears to factor into the rookie officer's decision-making process that night. Instead, the footage shows something simpler and more damaging. An officer continuing forward after the situation no longer requires it. Each command narrows his options. Each refusal to disengage deepens the legal exposure. By the time a supervisor is notified, the owner is already seated, restrained, and no longer free to leave. The cameras keep rolling. The store remains closed. And the case, though invisible in that moment, has already begun forming. The legality of what happens next does not hinge on tone or intent. It hinges on status. According to court filings, the man in handcuffs is not a suspect identified through an investigation, nor a trespasser discovered after forced entry. He is the registered owner of the business, present inside his own property after posted operating hours. That fact alone establishes a baseline that the law treats with particular clarity. The footage shows him explaining this more than once. He identifies himself as the owner. He references the business license displayed behind the counter. He explains that the store is closed and that he is finishing routine shutdown procedures. None of these statements are contradicted by visible evidence on camera. There is no sign of damage, no alarm triggered, no merchandise disturbed. The environment is orderly, quiet, and consistent with an after-hours close. Under the Fourth Amendment, this matters. Absent exigent circumstances or probable cause, an officer does not have authority to detain a person inside their own lawfully occupied business. The standard is not suspicion in the abstract. It is reasonable suspicion grounded in articulable facts. According to later testimony, no such facts were documented at the time of the encounter. The officer does not ask to verify ownership through records. He does not request dispatch confirmation. He does not pause to reassess. Instead, the footage captures a different pattern: repetition of commands already refused, followed by escalation. This is where the legitimacy gap widens. Each explanation offered by the owner reduces uncertainty. Each ignored explanation increases the officer's burden to justify continued detention. In legal terms, the balance shifts. What may have begun as a welfare check or an informal inquiry now requires constitutional grounding. The officer does not disengage. Instead, he begins framing the refusal to unlock the door as non-compliance. According to expert testimony later cited in the case, refusal to consent does not, by itself, create reasonable suspicion. The camera captures this moment clearly. The owner is not fleeing, not concealing anything, not threatening the officer. He is asserting a right. That assertion is treated as defiance. The cuffs remain on, the owner is moved away from the counter, his keys are taken. At no point does the footage show the officer discovering new information that would justify the detention. There is no contraband, no outstanding warrant disclosed on record, no witness alleging a crime. The situation stagnates, legally speaking, while physically progressing deeper into custody. This is another chance to stop. He doesn't. When a supervisor finally arrives, the dynamic shifts, but the outcome does not. The supervisor asks questions that should have been asked earlier. Ownership is discussed. Dispatch is consulted. According to records, confirmation comes back that the business is properly licensed and that no calls for service were associated with the address that evening. By that point, however, the damage is procedural. The detention has already occurred. The handcuffs have already closed. The seizure has already been completed. The supervisor does not immediately order release. Instead, the footage shows hesitation. The officer's earlier decisions now constrain the response. Reversing course would require acknowledging that the detention lacked legal foundation. Allowing it to continue compounds the exposure. Minutes pass. The owner remains restrained. Customers gather outside, watching through the glass. The cameras capture everything. From a legal standpoint, the case is no longer about what the officer thought at the beginning. It is about what the evidence shows after the facts are known. And at this point, the facts are no longer in dispute. The store is closed. The man is the owner. The detention continues anyway. What the footage does not show is just as important as what it captures. There is no argument about race spoken aloud, no explicit hostility, no overt insult. What appears instead is something more familiar to civil rights investigators, a pattern of control that continues even after the factual basis for it disappears. According to internal documents later introduced at trial, the officer had been on solo patrol for less than a year. His training records show completion of required academy modules, including instruction on consensual encounters, investigative detention, and arrest thresholds. On paper, the standards were known. In practice, the footage reveals how those standards can erode under stress, authority, and momentum. The department's policies, entered into evidence, are clear on one point. Officers are required to continuously reassess the legality of a detention as new information emerges. The moment reasonable suspicion dissipates, the detention must end. This is not discretionary language. It is mandatory. Yet the body camera shows no such reassessment. Instead, the officer's posture changes. His stance becomes squared. His voice lowers and hardens. Each instruction is delivered more slowly, more deliberately, as if control itself has become the objective. The owner's explanations no longer register as information to be evaluated. They are treated as obstacles. This shift is subtle but consequential. In court, it would later be described as decision inertia. Once a detention begins, reversing it feels, to some officers, like admitting error. The footage shows how that hesitation plays out in real time. The supervisor's arrival briefly interrupts this pattern. Questions are asked, dispatch confirmations are repeated. The owner's identity and legal status are no longer uncertain. According to testimony, the supervisor acknowledges that the business is properly owned and closed for the night. Still, the cuffs stay on. This is not explained on camera. There is no new allegation, no safety concern articulated, no discovery of evidence. The justification has not expanded. It has narrowed to nothing. And yet, the physical restraint remains. From an institutional standpoint, this is where the case begins to transcend individual error. Departmental culture becomes relevant not because of what is said, but because of what is allowed. The footage shows multiple officers now present, none initiating release. Responsibility diffuses. Each waits for another to make the first corrective move. That moment never comes. Instead, the owner is escorted outside. His store, fully closed, remains behind him. He is placed beside a patrol car, still restrained, while officers confer out of earshot. The cameras record the silence between commands, the absence of explanation, the growing crowd. This is another chance to stop. No one does. Later, in sworn statements, officers would describe the situation as unclear and developing. The video contradicts that characterization. By this point, nothing is developing. Everything that needed to be known has already been confirmed. What remains is a decision to continue anyway. That decision is not dramatic. It does not involve force beyond the cuffs already applied. It is administrative, procedural, almost quiet. And that is precisely what makes it consequential. In civil rights litigation, the most damaging violations often occur not during chaos, but during calm. By the time the owner is finally released, the encounter has lasted long enough to be unmistakable. The seizure was not momentary. It was sustained, and it occurred without a lawful basis that could survive scrutiny. The officer leaves the scene unaware of the chain he has set in motion. Internal affairs will later review the footage. City attorneys will later review the policies. And a jury, months from now, will watch the same quiet moments unfold on a courtroom screen. The escalation does not arrive with shouting or force. It arrives through time. According to the timestamps embedded in the footage, minutes pass after ownership is confirmed. The owner remains in handcuffs. No new questions are asked that would justify the continued restraint. No safety concerns are articulated. The scene stabilizes, but the detention does not end. This is where the constitutional analysis becomes unavoidable. Under established Fourth Amendment standards, the duration of a detention must be reasonably related to the circumstances that justified it in the first place. When those circumstances evaporate, continued restraint becomes unlawful. In this case, the justification did not merely weaken, it disappeared entirely. The officers on scene are now aware of three critical facts. The business is lawfully owned. It is closed. There is no crime under investigation. Each of those facts independently narrows the scope of permissible police action. Taken together, they eliminate it. And yet, the owner remains restrained. The footage shows officers conferring near the patrol car, voices low, body language hesitant. No one appears to be issuing commands. No one appears to be taking responsibility. This is not confusion. It is delay. And delay, in constitutional terms, is a decision. This is another chance to stop. They don't. Instead, the owner is told to wait. His hands remain behind his back. His phone is not returned. The cameras record his posture changing as the realization sets in that compliance has not resolved the situation. The assertion of his rights did not end the encounter. It prolonged it. From a legal standpoint, this is the pivot point. The detention has crossed from questionable to indefensible. Experts later testify that once officers knew the man was the owner and that no offense had occurred, the continued use of handcuffs served no legitimate law enforcement purpose. At that moment, the restraint itself became the violation, not because of malice, but because of inertia. The footage does not capture panic. It captures something colder, a system continuing forward because stopping would require acknowledgement. This is the silence that matters. No one raises their voice. No one explains the delay. The owner stands restrained beside his own closed business while the officers decide, quietly, how to exit a situation they no longer control. The cameras keep recording. The crowd watches. The power dynamic has already shifted. Eventually, the handcuffs come off. There is no announcement, no apology, no explanation recorded on camera. The owner is told he is free to go. The officers return to their vehicles. The scene dissolves without resolution. But the legal consequences do not dissolve with it. What the footage preserves is not a moment of conflict, but a sequence of decisions that can be measured. The duration of the detention, the absence of cause, the failure to disengage. Each element will later be cataloged, time-stamped, and replayed. By the time the store owner reopens his door and resumes closing procedures, the encounter has already outgrown the street. It has entered the domain of internal review, civil litigation, and public record. And that process has only just begun. The evidence does not change after the scene ends. It accumulates. Within days, the footage is logged into the department's evidence system. Multiple camera angles are preserved, the officer's body cam, exterior security cameras from the storefront, and a neighboring business's CCTV that captures the moment the patrol car arrives. Together, they create a continuous timeline with no meaningful gaps. According to internal review documents later disclosed, the first assessment focuses on duration. Investigators note how long the owner remained in handcuffs after his identity and ownership were confirmed. They note the absence of any articulated suspicion during that period. They note that no citation was issued, no arrest report filed, and no criminal charge ever contemplated. The question is no longer what happened. It is why it continued. The review then moves to policy. Department guidelines require officers to document the legal basis for detention beyond an initial stop. In this case, the documentation is thin. Reports reference investigative detention without identifying a suspected offense. Supervisors reviewing the file flag this immediately. According to testimony, the phrase appears repeatedly without supporting facts. The footage is played internally, not once, but many times. In one sequence that becomes central at trial, the camera shows the owner standing silently beside the patrol car, hands restrained, while officers speak among themselves. No commands are issued. No safety threat is visible. The silence stretches. In court, that silence will be replayed without commentary, allowing jurors to draw their own conclusions. This is the second hook, and it does not rely on narration. As the internal review progresses, the matter escalates. What begins as a supervisory inquiry is referred to internal affairs. Internal affairs requests training records, prior complaints, and performance evaluations for the officer involved. According to records, no similar incidents are substantiated, but investigators note concerns about judgment under low-stress conditions. The city attorney's office is notified soon after. By this point, the legal exposure is no longer hypothetical. Civil Rights Counsel representing the store owner submits a notice of claim, citing unlawful detention and violation of constitutional rights. The claim references timestamps, policy language, and specific frames from the footage. It does not allege intent. It alleges duration. Depositions follow. Officers are asked the same question in different ways. At what moment did reasonable suspicion exist, and when did it end? The answers vary. The video does not. When the case reaches trial, the jury is shown exactly what internal reviewers saw. The footage is played without music, without narration, without emphasis. Just time passing. Just handcuffs staying on. According to the verdict form later entered into the record, jurors find that the detention continued after any lawful basis had dissipated. They find that this continuation constituted a violation of the owner's rights. Damages are assessed accordingly. The number is precise. $940,000. That figure does not arrive suddenly. It is the sum of minutes, decisions, and silences measured against constitutional standards. And once it is read aloud in court, it cannot be retracted. For the city, the verdict triggers mandatory reporting. For the department, it triggers policy review. And for the officer, it marks the beginning of consequences that extend beyond the courtroom. The verdict does not close the file. It opens several others. Once the jury's decision is entered, the city is required to act. According to municipal procedure, any civil rights verdict exceeding a defined threshold triggers automatic review by the Risk Management Office and the police department's command staff. The $940,000 award meets that threshold by a wide margin. Within weeks, the department initiates a formal disciplinary process. Internal Affairs reopens the case, this time not to determine whether a policy violation occurred, but to assess accountability in light of the jury's findings. The standard has shifted. The question is no longer internal compliance. It is whether continued employment is defensible after a federal constitutional violation has been confirmed in open court. The officer is placed on administrative leave pending review. Department records later introduced show that investigators focus on a narrow window of time, the period after ownership was confirmed and before the handcuffs were removed. That window becomes dispositive. Training materials are compared against the footage. Supervisory expectations are contrasted with actual conduct. The conclusion is not framed as misconduct driven by intent, but as failure to disengage when required. In disciplinary language, that distinction does not mitigate the outcome. According to the termination notice later referenced in public reporting, the officer is found to have violated departmental policy on unlawful detention and failure to reassess probable cause. The language is clinical. It does not reference race. It does not reference motive. It references time, authority, and restraint. Employment is terminated. For the city, the consequences extend further. The verdict is reported to the insurer. Premiums are reassessed. City Council receives a briefing outlining how the incident unfolded, how long the detention lasted, and why it resulted in nearly 7 figures in damages. The briefing includes still frames from the footage, selected not for drama but for clarity. Policy changes follow. The department issues updated guidance emphasizing that handcuffing constitutes a seizure requiring ongoing justification. Supervisors are instructed to intervene earlier in ambiguous detentions. Training scenarios are revised to include after-hours business encounters, specifically highlighting the distinction between refusal to consent and reasonable suspicion. These changes are not presented as reforms born of outrage. They are framed as risk mitigation. Meanwhile, the store owner's life returns, gradually, to routine. He reopens his business. Customers return. The physical marks of the incident fade. The legal record does not. The verdict is now part of public case law, cited in training materials and legal briefings as an example of how duration alone can render a detention unconstitutional. The officer does not speak publicly. In subsequent proceedings unrelated to the case, his name appears only in administrative context. According to records, there is no criminal charge. There does not need to be. The civil judgment has already defined the boundary that was crossed. What makes this case endure is not its spectacle. It is its simplicity. No chase, no weapons, no emergency, just a closed store, a lawful owner, and handcuffs that stayed on longer than the law allows. In court, that simplicity proved decisive. Jurors did not have to infer intent or weigh competing narratives. They watched time pass on video and applied the instructions they were given. The result was unambiguous. For the department, the case becomes a reference point. For city attorneys, it becomes a cautionary example. For officers in training, it becomes a reminder that authority is conditional and reversible. And for anyone reviewing the footage later, the lesson is the same. The most expensive mistakes are often the quiet ones. The verdict did not accuse, it measured. After the paperwork is filed and the policy memos are circulated, the case settles into its final form not as a headline, but as a reference. Within the department, the footage is incorporated into training reviews. Recruits are shown the same timestamps the jury saw. They are not asked how they would feel in the moment. They are asked when, precisely, the detention should have ended. The exercise is clinical. The answer is measurable. Command staff emphasize a single principle. Authority does not accumulate simply because it has been asserted. It must be continuously justified. When justification ends, authority reverses. The city's response follows a similar logic. Risk management updates exposure models. Legal staff revise settlement projections for unlawful detention cases. The lesson is not abstract. It is financial. Nearly $1 million was paid not because of force, injury, or intent, but because of time. Minutes mattered. For civil rights attorneys, the verdict becomes a citation. In briefs and motions, it is referenced alongside other cases establishing that duration alone can transform a lawful stop into a constitutional violation. The case is not remembered for who the officer was, but for how long the cuffs stayed on after the facts were known. The store owner does not give speeches. According to public records, he does not pursue further litigation. His role in the system ends where it began inside his business, exercising rights that were always his. The difference is that those rights are now documented, time-stamped, and affirmed by a jury. What the cameras captured that night was not chaos. It was order applied past its limits. There was no confusion about ownership, no emergency unfolding, no threat emerging, just a decision not to stop when stopping was required. That decision was quiet, procedural, and costly. In the end, the footage made the conclusion unavoidable, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete. It showed when authority should have yielded and did not. It showed restraint continuing after reason ended. And it showed how the law responds when that line is crossed. This is how accountability often appears not as a confrontation, but as a record, a sequence, a duration, a number read aloud in a courtroom. The jury did not speculate. It watched, and it measured. Do you want me to continue?